The Crossroad Introduction. A normal life turned into the revolution, traveling in search of my soul. Finding Buddhism took me to Sydney, the monk missionary, the city of churches. Wishing farewell changed my destiny. The cafe at River Torrens. In the new lights, the rest became history. Christ showed me a junction. I was at a crossroad. Two paths lay before me. I had to choose Christ or Buddha. I chose Christ, or, to be more real, he chose me. It had been on a long and winding road. Born into a liberal humanist, non-Christian family, and having been through a relocation from the US to England at age 15, I then went through the educational system as far as commencing a university course. But by that time, my enthusiasm for academic education had waned. It was then the late 1960s. Rock music, drugs, chiefly cannabis, and the hippie culture were the big new thing for me. We even called it a revolution. But it wasn't a true revolution because our hearts were not changed. True, we did find some new ways of thinking and living. But in reality, I was still living for myself, despite my revolution banner. Though I dropped out of university, I still stayed around the city of Cambridge, UK, because I enjoyed the youth culture there. In that context, I met the girl I later married. It is sad to say that I really was not ready for marriage. Nor did I have Christ in my life. To my shame, I must admit that the hippie idea of love, the one you're with, influenced my thinking. Though I was not promiscuous in practice, I was promiscuous in attitude. I believe my attitude was the main factor in the breakup of our marriage, after being together for 2.5 years. Fortunately, we had no children. The only good thing about all this is that there was no bitterness between us. In terms of my soul, however, the breakup caused much grief. It caused me to think more deeply about myself and about life, and to try to find some answers. I had long wished to travel, thinking especially of the hippie trail overland to India. I found a friend who wanted to journey the same way, so we prepared and then set out together, planning to take buses through Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan and Pakistan. Whilst in Turkey, an incident happened which stayed in my heart. We were in Istanbul and I had a free afternoon, so I went for a walk up a hillside road. As I turned a corner, I found myself at a military checkpost. The guard pointed his gun at me, and I stretched forth my hands as if to protect myself from bullets, at which he started laughing. I was panicking and fearing death at any moment. The guard allowed me to turn around and go back, but the whole incident showed me how much I was fearful of death, and that stayed with me. My friend and I continued on by bus through Iran and Afghanistan until we arrived in Peshawar, Pakistan, where we were welcomed by an English friend who lived there. In Pakistan, cannabis could be obtained easily. Though my travelling companion was obliged to press on his way towards Australia, I was in no hurry to leave this fascinating and beautiful country. My father was kindly giving me an allowance of £15 per week, which in those days would cover my living costs in Pakistan, so I stayed on. I spent lots of time in Rawalpindi, living in a cheap hotel, eating what I cooked myself on a camp stove in my room, or else occasionally eating out in a high-class restaurant, which was still within my budget. I made a Pakistani friend who still communicates with me on Facebook. Islam, which was everywhere, began to fascinate me. I bought a translation of the Quran, and on one occasion I attended a mosque. What do you think of the life hereafter? One elderly white-bearded man asked me pointedly. It certainly made me think. Starting to explore, I travelled more than once to the mountains, reaching as far as Gilgit and also the kingdom of Hunza. I remember once, back in Rawalpindi, being in a place near the legal offices and courts lawyers were doing paperwork on tables which were placed outdoors under the shade of trees. While I was in that area, I encountered a group of Pakistani Christians who were walking and singing together. I was struck by their joy. I was becoming quite settled, but my visa was only for 6 months and could not be renewed. I needed to prepare to move on. I had always intended to go onwards to the Holy Land of India. With my Pakistani friend, I went to visit an archaeological site nearby, and as we explored the ruins, we met other tourists, especially an older man who was there with his family. He was a Parsi, Zoroastrian, and he was known slightly by my Muslim friend. The man was a strong believer in God in the Zoroastrian tradition. As he and I got talking, he questioned me about my own life and my plans. I told him something about my situation and my searching. He challenged me. It seemed that he cut across me. I felt angered, and yet I felt that my anger was hitting at someone who was trying to help me. He said to me, "When you go to India, you need to find a guru and place your life in his hands." I followed this advice. I gave up both cigarettes and cannabis. And when I crossed into India, I headed straight for Dharamshala, MacLeod Ganj, in northern India, which was the home of the Tibetan Buddhists and the Dalai Lama. On arrival, I made a start on the courses they held, which were mainly attended by young Westerners. Somehow, I found that studying texts in a classroom setting wasn't where I wanted to be. I felt I needed something more immediate and direct. Many seekers were in Dharamshala, and I mingled with them. I managed to meet an Australian couple. The man, Chris, having trained himself in the way of Zen, had a quiet authority and a way of speaking which held one's attention. The woman, Kate, who was nursing a baby, seemed to possess a kind of psychic insight. I quickly found that I was passing the time sitting with Chris and Kate, listening to Chris's down-to-earth teaching and his comments on human existence. I was becoming a disciple, and other young people also joined our band. Chris called us novice monks, and such we were. Even though we were staying in different hotels and hostels, we spent most of our time together. We began to feel like a family, doing daily tasks together, and, to some extent, we were sharing our money. As I remember it, there were eventually 8 of us there, who formed a kind of core. We were told that another member was waiting in Delhi to join us, and eventually we set out for Delhi ourselves. Once we were there, we stayed briefly in a couple of different ashrams, but eventually settled in a hotel, and our life again focused on listening to Chris as he taught us principles of Zen Buddhism, and as we learned to do sitting meditation for ourselves. Using these techniques, our meditation was often monitored by Chris telepathically, as he had that ability. Our lives were quite disciplined, and in many ways, Chris exercised a lot of control over us. Chris said he had been to Japan and had learned meditation there. He was not affiliated with any established group, so his Buddhist-inspired principles were in some ways self-taught. Under Chris's instruction, we were seeking the experience of Satori, which in Zen means enlightenment, freedom from self-consciousness. There were elements of truth within our life and teaching, but there was also an element of fear of what Chris would do or say. In some ways, our life was cult-like. So we were a small monastic Buddhist-inspired community in the heart of Delhi. We were sharing our time, our money, our life, and we intended our commitment to be lifelong. Chris's aim was to move us to Australia. To do this, we needed to get visas and money for tickets. We all cooperated in this, and eventually we were ready to start the journey, which we did in pairs. My traveling companion for this was an American named Michael. We were told to travel to Sydney by air and then to make our way to Nimbin, a small town in northern New South Wales, where there were many young people experimenting in alternative living. At Nimbin, I was kindly accommodated by an Aborigine and his wife who lived in a massive, transparent geodesic dome. Michael and I stayed in the area as other members of the group began arriving to join us. One time, two of the tough guys from the local Nimbin community asked me to go on a hike with them to the cliff top nearby, and they implied that they would throw me over the cliff to test me. I did not go with them, and I remember being struck by how afraid of death I was. Sometime during our stay in Nimbin, I found a copy of John's Gospel which I kept with me. Eventually, Chris and Kate also arrived, and a Nimbin person who joined our group kindly offered us the use of her farmhouse, surrounded by banana plantations in which we could practice our meditation lifestyle. That was the period when we were at our most cohesive as a community. It was probably only a month or two, but our meditation under Chris's instruction was quite intensive. On one occasion, we had a brief visit from some Christian evangelicals who were very confrontational, saying that we needed to be saved through Jesus and that there was hope only through him. We were, of course, dismissive of this, but the impression of it stayed with me. At the end of this farmhouse period, Chris began to send us out as traveling monks, missionaries, to go forth and spread the Buddhism which we had been taught. I was one of the last novices to leave. Something in me wanted to stay with Chris, but in the end I had to go, and I set out hitchhiking on my own with my shaven head, my rucksack, and not much money. So the world lay before me. I paused briefly in Lismore, but then began to make the southwards trek towards Sydney. Chris had taught us that we would find Christians who would be friendly towards us. Because of this, as I was on my journey, I approached Christians, asking if I could perhaps stay the night in their church hall. I remember that they not only helped with that, but also gave me food, and of course, shared the good news of Jesus. I met many people on my way south through New South Wales, and I remember one Christian lady who was feeding me, and I said something to the effect that I believed there were many ways to the same God, and she quietly but firmly disagreed with me. So I finally reached the outskirts of Sydney. It was evening, and I didn't know where I could find a place to sleep. So I followed my intuition, trusting somehow that I would be led to the right place, went down some suburban side streets and knocked on a particular door as I felt led. An older woman answered the door, and I explained that I was looking for a place to spend the night as I was a Buddhist monk on my journey. Amazingly, this older woman actually took me into her house for the night. She was living on her own, and she let me sleep in her lounge. I felt that it was extraordinary to take a strange young man with a bald head to your house on his first approach to your door. I made my way into central Sydney and sat begging in front of a church building facing the street. As I remember it, a young man named Steve approached me, and after we had chatted a while about what I was doing, he asked me where I would be spending the night. I said I was planning to sleep there on the streets, but he persuaded me to come back to his shared house near the King's Cross area where I could sleep on the floor. That house became my home for a while, and I actually thought, I'll get a job because I wanted to be contributing something to the house. So I got a job as a pots and pans washer in a steakhouse, and it was good to be working. But eventually I had communication with Chris, and he said, "You are called to be a monk, not to be an ordinary employed person. You are supposed to be helping people with their spiritual needs." So I heeded that call, which meant that I decided to leave Sydney. So I set out hitching, going westwards through the Blue Mountains and on towards Adelaide. Adelaide is known as the City of Churches. Certainly it has a more spacious feel than Sydney, though it's nowhere near as big. On arriving there, I met someone who allowed me to stay at his house for a night, but then he wanted me to work for him the following day, and I realized that was against Chris's instruction, So I said sorry, and I went in search of another place to lay my head, eventually finding a squat where I actually had a room to myself. I enjoyed Adelaide and made a few friends there. It seemed my life was on hold. I enjoyed exploring the city and spending time in the large cathedral. Eventually, it came to what felt like the right time to leave. I packed my stuff into my rucksack, traveling light, and started hitchhiking out of the city going south. I wasn't standing there looking for a lift long, for I was soon picked up by a carload of happy young people who were on their way to a church service. The car was driven by a young man named Gary. I seem to remember that they treated me to a fast food meal before we got to the church, which was called Bethesda House of Mercy. It was a big gathering, and the preacher had power. I listened attentively, and amongst the many things he said, one sentence stood out, where he said, "And what is more, God is going to free his people from self-consciousness." This was a word to my heart, because self-consciousness was the very thing which our disciplined meditation practice was seeking to liberate us from. Gary, the car driver, must have noticed that I was listening well, and he took the bold step of inviting me to stay with him and his parents for a week while he brought me to the different church events every night of the week. His parents amazingly agreed to his request, even though I must have seemed weird to them. I did indeed attend with Gary every night that week, going to teaching sessions, worship sessions, fellowship times, etc. I remember a particular conversation with the youth pastor who shook me up by declaring that God was actually prejudiced in favor of his people. The idea of God having favorites bothered me. At the end of the week, I had to go onwards from Gary's parents' house. I returned to the squat. Where was I to go now? A lot of pondering started. I had certainly heard a lot of the gospel now. Yet the groove which I was still in was Buddhism. Meditation was my norm. Adelaide was pleasant. It was summertime. I walked around the city. I made friends with those in the squat. In my mind, I turned over the things I'd heard. If I may describe that time, it was as if there was a curtain or a veil over the eyes of my heart, and I was making attempts to draw it back. In the end, I settled that I would continue as a Buddhist, but I also wanted to visit my Christian friends at Bethesda once more, to tell them that I'd made this choice and to bid them farewell. So I made my way to the church again. I arrived there just at the beginning of another large preaching gathering where the man who stood up at the front was a person who dealt with deliverance ministry. He was very knowledgeable about casting demons out of people, so he majored on that subject, saying the devil is an actual person, not just some kind of force or emotion, and that we need deliverance from him. As he spoke, I could literally feel the demons within my own body moving around inside me, resisting the message. At the end, there was an invitation to come for prayer, and I went up to the front and said to God, "If it's true that Jesus is the only way to come to God, please show me." This brought me to a new point in my search. My soul was really being challenged by this ministry about the devil being a real person and the need to be delivered by Jesus. So again, I returned to the squat. I was now impelled forward. There was an urgency. I had to let this sink in. I couldn't leave Adelaide now. Frequently, I would walk around the beautiful city with its wide streets and its parks. One afternoon, I visited a cafe overlooking the River Torrens, and there were other customers there with whom I struck up a conversation. One of them was an old man who said he was a Methodist. He seemed to have a gentle and clear spirit. As we conversed, I asked him the question, which was now so near to my heart: is it true that Jesus is the only way to God? He looked me in the eyes and nodded a clear affirmative as he simply said, "Yes." This encounter reached my heart. God spoke through that man. Our normal Buddhist practice was to start each day by doing half an hour of sitting meditation as soon as we woke up. So I awoke one morning, soon after meeting the Methodist man, and I began my meditation. I saw in my mind's eye that I was on a path, spiritually speaking, and I had a junction in front of me, one road leading to Buddha and the other to Christ. I realized that the choice was mine, and I chose Christ. At that moment, I knew God. I got up from my meditation. It was a sunny day. I went into the garden. It seemed like everything was new. It seemed that I could see every glistening thing through new eyes. Wonderment. I knew God was a real person, not just a state of consciousness, nor a mere emptiness of self. He was a real person, the Father of Jesus. And I could talk with him, and he with me. I felt surrounded by the Holy Spirit, God's own presence. As I walked around the thick, unmown grass, I remember losing something, perhaps a pen or some small object. In such dense grass, I could not spot it despite searching. But then I thought, I will ask God. I did this and then found it quickly. A small sign, but real. My whole self felt more relaxed than I'd ever felt before. It was like being in love, exhilarating, full of freshness in thinking and perception. I knew all was well with my soul. My sins were forgiven. I was alive. Jesus was Lord. I was born again. He is risen. I now had a personal relationship with him. The rest is history. I stayed there in Adelaide for a month or so, learning what it was to be part of a church, beginning to be a disciple. I became a co-evangelist with a brother named Peter, and we eventually headed to Sydney on an evangelistic adventure. Soon after reaching Sydney, my dad kindly purchased me an airfare back to the United Kingdom, where new pages of my Christian life started to turn over. All glory to Lord Jesus.
My friend, you might be going through something right now that you might not understand. But don't you worry. What I have to say can bring a change in your life. You see, no weapon formed against you can prosper. It's in the Word. And if you need help, all you gotta do is ask. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds. And to those who knock, it will be opened. Yeah.